So, I want to tell you about Larry. Larry Hoskin was 34 years old. He worked on his family's grain farm outside Millersburg, Ohio. Same land his grandfather had farmed, same rusted equipment, same crumbling silos his dad had always said he'd tear down someday. Someday never came. It was November 1987. And I want you to understand something about grain silos before we go any further, because most people don't. Most people picture them as these big, quiet, empty cylinders, kind of peaceful almost. They're not. Inside a working silo, grain settles, it compacts, and when it does, it forms a crust, a hard shell near the walls that looks solid, looks like you could walk on it, looks stable. It isn't. Underneath that crust, it's like quicksand, loose grain, sometimes 20, 30 feet deep, that will swallow a grown man in seconds. Farmers call it grain entrapment, and it kills dozens of people every single year in the United States alone. Most of them on family farms. Most of them people who knew better. Larry knew better.
It was a Tuesday morning when the auger jammed. The auger is basically a big mechanical screw that moves grain out of the silo. When it clogs, someone has to go in and break up the blockage by hand. Larry had done it 100 times. His brother Dale was supposed to go with him. Dale got a phone call, said he'd be 5 minutes. Larry said, "I'll just get started." He climbed the ladder on the outside of the silo, an old corrugated steel one, about 40 feet tall. He unlatched the hatch at the top. He swung his legs over, grabbed the interior rungs, and he climbed down inside. Now, here's where I want you to picture this, because I think it matters. It's November. It's cold. The inside of that silo is dim, a little gray light filtering in from the hatch above him. The grain below is corn. Dry, compacted corn that's been sitting since harvest. It smells like dust and mold and something slightly sweet that turns your stomach after a while. Larry stepped off the ladder onto what looked like a solid floor. He took maybe 2 steps, and then the crust gave way.
He said later, and this is documented, this is in his own words to the Millersburg Gazette in 1989, he said it didn't feel like falling. It felt like the ground reached up and grabbed him. 1 second he was standing, and the next second he was in it, up to his waist, and he couldn't move his legs at all. He tried to pull himself up. He couldn't. He tried to lean forward, grab the grain, swim toward the wall. He'd read somewhere that if you keep moving in quicksand, you sink faster. And it's the same with grain. Every movement pulled him deeper. By the time he stopped struggling, he was in up to his chest. He shouted for Dale. Dale was still on the phone. The silo walls were corrugated steel, 40 feet tall, 18 inches thick in insulation. The sound didn't carry. Not really. Not the way you'd hope. Larry stopped shouting. He said he made a decision in that moment, a completely rational, calm decision, that he was going to die in that silo, and that the only question was how long it was going to take. Here's the thing about grain entrapment that nobody talks about. It's not fast. It doesn't kill you immediately. It kills you slowly, in a way that I think is one of the most psychologically brutal ways a person can go. Because you're not drowning. You can breathe. The grain pressing against your chest makes it hard, but you can breathe. You're not freezing to death. Not yet. You're just stuck. Standing up, in the dark, unable to move anything below your armpits, completely alone, in a steel tube in rural Ohio. And you wait. Larry waited for 4 hours. He said the first hour wasn't bad. He stayed calm. He told himself Dale would come. He watched the light from the hatch above him shift slightly as the clouds moved. He counted his breaths. He prayed, which he said he hadn't done since he was a teenager. The second hour, the grain settled more. It was up to his collarbone now. Breathing was harder. Every exhale, the grain pressed in a little tighter, and it didn't loosen when he inhaled. It just stayed. It was slow compression. He said it felt like someone was sitting on his chest, just sitting there, getting slightly heavier every 20 minutes. The third hour, he started to panic. Not loud, frantic panic. He described it as quiet panic, the kind where your mind starts doing things you can't control. He started hearing sounds that weren't there. He thought he heard his mother calling him from outside, which wasn't possible because his mother had been dead for 6 years. He thought the grain was warm, which also wasn't possible. He said at one point he became completely convinced that there was something else in the silo with him, something under the grain, something that was why the grain was warm. He knew it wasn't real. He knew. But he couldn't stop feeling it pressing up from below.
Dale found him at 11:40 in the morning. He looked down through the hatch and saw just Larry's head and one arm sticking out of the grain, perfectly still. He thought Larry was dead. Larry wasn't dead, but he couldn't speak. He'd been breathing so shallowly for so long that he'd used up most of his energy just keeping his airway open. He could blink, and that was it. Dale called 911. Then he did something that the paramedics would later tell him almost certainly saved Larry's life. He climbed down and started digging with his hands. Just his bare hands, scooping grain away from Larry's chest, not even knowing if it was doing anything, because for every scoop he pulled out, more slid back in from the sides. But it relieved just enough pressure that Larry could breathe a little deeper. The Millersburg Fire Department arrived 22 minutes later. They had a green rescue tube, a corrugated metal sleeve that you drive down around the victim and then auger out the grain from inside the tube. It's the only reliable way to get someone out. It took them another 47 minutes. When they finally lifted Larry out, he couldn't walk, couldn't feel his legs at all. The sustained pressure had temporarily cut off circulation, and for about 6 hours after his rescue, the doctors weren't sure if he'd have permanent damage. He didn't. He walked out of Pomerene Hospital 3 days later.
I've been thinking about Larry a lot lately. Not because of the grain, though that's terrifying enough on its own, but because of what he said in that interview. The reporter asked him what the worst part was, and you'd expect him to say the pressure, or the breathing, or thinking he was going to die. He didn't say any of that. He said the worst part was the quiet. He said, "I kept thinking, I'm 40 feet in the air and 4 feet underground at the same time. I'm inside something and I can't move, and no one knows I'm here. That's not a place a person is supposed to be." And then he said something that I haven't been able to shake. He said after they got him out, after he was in the hospital, after the feeling came back in his legs and his wife was holding his hand, he still didn't feel safe. He said for weeks afterward, he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he couldn't tell if he was in his bed or still in the silo. He'd have to turn the light on. He'd have to feel the sheets. He'd have to listen for his wife breathing. He said, the silo didn't follow me home, but the quiet did.
Grain entrapment kills an average of 35 people per year in the United States. Most victims are experienced farm workers. Most incidents happen during routine maintenance. Most could be prevented. If you work around grain bins or know someone who does, never enter one alone. Never enter a bin while grain is flowing. Use a safety harness, a spotter, a rescue tube on site. Because the thing about that kind of silence, the kind Larry described, is that it doesn't care how experienced you are. It's just waiting.
Okay, let me back up. It's 1922, March. Rural Germany, a small farming community called Hinterkaifeck. The nearest neighbor is maybe half a mile away.
Far enough that if something happened at the Gruber farm, you wouldn't hear it. You'd just notice, eventually, that you hadn't seen anyone in a while. The patriarch, Andreas Gruber, he'd been acting strange for weeks before it happened, telling people in the village that he'd found footprints in the snow. Footprints leading from the tree line toward the farmhouse, but none leading back. He'd also found an unfamiliar newspaper on the property. A set of house keys went missing. And at night, he told people he could hear footsteps in the attic. He told the neighbors. He told people at church. But he didn't call the police. Didn't leave. Nobody really knows why. Maybe he thought he was imagining it. Maybe he was too stubborn. Maybe, and this is the part that gets me, maybe he just couldn't bring himself to believe that someone was already inside.
On the evening of March 31st, 1922, someone lured the family members into the barn, one by one. Andreas first, then his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and then Victoria's daughter, little Cecilia, 11 years old. She was found with her hair torn out in fistfuls, which means she wasn't killed immediately. She was alive long enough to be terrified. The farmhand and the baby, 2-year-old Josef, were killed inside the house. The weapon was a mattock, a farming tool. Whoever did this used what was already there.
Here's where it stops being just a horrible story and becomes something else entirely. The investigating officers who arrived on April 4th, 4 days later, noticed immediately that the farm had not been abandoned. The cattle had been fed, recently. The mail that had piled up over the days had been brought inside. Someone had cooked food in the kitchen and eaten it. The neighbors who finally came to check on the family said there had been smoke coming from the chimney all week. Whoever killed 6 people in that farmhouse didn't run. They stayed. They fed the animals. They slept there. For 4 days, they lived among the people they had murdered. The case was never solved. In the chaos of post-World War I Germany, the investigation was mishandled almost immediately. Evidence was poorly documented. The skulls were actually sent to a Munich lab to be examined, and then they were lost. The Nazi regime later destroyed what remaining case files existed. Over 100 suspects were interviewed. Nothing. There are theories, of course. Some people think it was a drifter. Some point to a dark family secret. There were rumors, ugly ones, about Andreas and his daughter Victoria, and whether Joseph, the baby, was actually his son. Some investigators thought the killer was someone from the village, someone who knew the farm, someone who knew the family trusted no one and would handle things themselves, someone who knew that no one would check on them for days. What I find genuinely, disturbing isn't even the right word. What unsettles me in a way I can't fully explain is this. The footprints Andreas found in the snow, walking toward the house with no return tracks. Investigators confirmed those later. They were real, which means someone had been watching the farm for some time before the murders. Watching, learning the routines, figuring out who came and went and when. And Andreas knew. He told people. He felt it. That specific feeling of being watched in a place that should be safe. He described it to multiple people in the weeks before he died. He just couldn't do anything about it. Or didn't. We'll never know which. The farmhouse was demolished in the 1920s. There's nothing there now. The village of Hinterkaifeck itself barely exists anymore. Swallowed up, renamed, absorbed into the landscape. But every few years, someone reopens the case. A criminology class, a documentary, a journalist. Because the thing about an unsolved case like this isn't the mystery of who did it. It's the image that stays with you after you close the laptop. A chimney with smoke rising from it. Cattle fed and watered. A family inside that no one was looking for yet. And whoever was in that house, eating, sleeping, going about their days, knowing exactly what was in the barn. If you want to go deeper, the Hinterkaifeck case has been analyzed by forensic investigators as recently as 2007, when a criminology class at a German university re-examined the evidence. They produced a 150-page report. Their conclusion? The killer was almost certainly someone the family knew.
The thing that nobody talks about is the feat. 9 experienced hikers in the middle of a Soviet winter in the Ural Mountains, temperatures hitting minus 30, and they ran out of their tent without their boots on. They didn't grab coats, they didn't grab food. They cut their way out through the side of the tent, from the inside, and they ran. Whatever they heard, or saw, or felt, leaving was less terrifying than staying.
January 1959. A group of 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out to ski across the northern Urals. It was a grade 3 expedition, the highest difficulty rating at the time. These weren't beginners. The leader, Igor Dyatlov, was experienced, methodical, respected, the kind of person who checked everything twice. One member turned back early with a knee problem. That decision saved his life, though he wouldn't know that for weeks. The group made camp on the slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakli. It means dead mountain. I know how that sounds, but that's what it was called, and that's where they stopped.
On February 12th, they were supposed to make contact with a sporting club back in the city. They didn't. Nobody panicked immediately. Weather delays happen, schedules slip. But by the 20th, the family started pushing. A search party went out on the 26th. They found the tent first. It was half collapsed under snow, partially buried, and it had been cut open from the inside. Long, deliberate slashes through the canvas, big enough to climb through. Their belongings were still inside. Boots, coats, food, a camera, a journal. Everything you need to survive was right there. And they left it. The searchers followed footprints in the snow leading away from the tent. 9 sets. Walking. Not running, at first. They were barefoot, or in socks, in minus 30. The footprints led about 500 meters down the slope toward the tree line, and then the snow swallowed them. They found the first 2 bodies near a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. Igor Dyatlov's friend Yuri Doroshenko and another student, Yuri Krivonishenko, both frozen, both in their underwear. The branches of the cedar, up to about 5 meters high, were broken, like someone had climbed it, desperately, quickly, and snapped them on the way up. Their hands were burned, not severely, but the skin was damaged in a way consistent with reaching into an open flame. There was a small fire nearby, almost burned out. In that cold, in those clothes, that fire would not have kept anyone alive for long, but they built it anyway. 3 more bodies were found nearby, including Dyatlov himself. Their poses suggested they died trying to crawl back toward the tent. They froze before they made it. The remaining 4 weren't found until May, when the snow melted. They were in a ravine about 70 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. They'd apparently built a more substantial shelter there, cut branches, dug in. But what happened to them didn't make sense.
The 4 in the ravine had massive internal injuries. One woman, Ludmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips.
The medical examiner said the soft tissue damage could have been caused by decomposition and meltwater. Some researchers disagree. Her injuries have never been fully explained. 2 of the men had broken ribs, the kind of fractures you'd see in a car accident. The forensic expert at the time said the force required to cause that damage would have been enormous, but there were no external wounds, no bruising on the skin. Whatever broke their ribs did it from the inside out, or with a force so sudden the body didn't have time to bruise. One of them was missing his eyes, too. The Soviet government closed the investigation in May 1959. The official conclusion was that the hikers died as a result of a compelling natural force. That's a direct quote. A compelling natural force. They closed the file, and that's what they wrote.
People have been trying to solve this for 60 years. Avalanche. But the snow around the tent was undisturbed, and the slope angle was too shallow. Infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves that can cause panic and disorientation. It's a real phenomenon, but there's no evidence of a source. Military testing in the area. Possible. The Soviets were running experiments nearby, but nothing confirmed. The Mansi people? Investigated and cleared almost immediately. In 2019, Russian prosecutors officially reopened the case and investigated for 2 years. Their conclusion? An avalanche-like snow slab event caused the hikers to flee in a panic. Most researchers reject this. The tent was pitched on a slope that didn't support that kind of slide, and it doesn't explain the internal injuries. It doesn't explain the missing eyes and tongue. It doesn't explain why experienced mountaineers, people who knew cold, who knew mountains, chose to run downhill away from their gear instead of rerouting around any danger back to shelter. It doesn't explain what they were so afraid of, that bare feet in -30 felt like the safer option.
There's a photograph that was recovered from one of the cameras found at the camp, taken that last night by one of the hikers. It shows the slope above the tent. Dark, grainy, the exposure not quite right. There's something in the upper corner of the frame. A shape. Bright, slightly blurred. It could be a camera flare. It could be a long exposure smear of a flashlight. It could be absolutely nothing. Just film grain and darkness doing what film grain and darkness do. Researchers have argued about it for decades. What nobody argues about is this. Whoever took that photo was standing outside the tent when they took it, looking up the slope, pointing the camera at something above them. And then they went back inside. And then, sometime later that night, they cut their way out and ran.
The Dyatlov Pass incident occurred on the night of February 1 to 2, 1959, on Holat Syakhl in the Ural Mountains, USSR. 9 hikers died. The case was classified by Soviet authorities and officially remains unsolved. The pass was renamed Dyatlov Pass in 1959 in honor of the group's leader. The photograph exists. You can find it.